just received and our presence on unceded land, and acknowledge all of the indigenous peoples of the Lower Mainland of British Columbia. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Your Worship. I'm so impressed. I know the nature of the demands on the mayor, and for you to spend most of your day here indicates a real commitment to these issues, and I think that's just terrific. So thank you, and I look forward very much to your participation later on. And I do want to acknowledge also the events in Toronto this week. For those of you, how many people here have lived in Toronto at some point or other? Okay, fair number. It just doesn't feel like Toronto. In my current role, I'm obliged to travel quite a bit, and I was in London, England this week when I got the news, and my colleague showed me an alert on her phone, and it just seemed unreal. And it's tragic. It's tragic for the families involved. It's tragic because of the apparent motivations of the young man. And I know people in Toronto are healing, but it's going to take time. And one of the strengths in Toronto, and its amazing strength, is that we have people from every country in the world. We also have people who are newcomers. More than half of the people in Toronto are newcomers. That is, we're not born in Canada, including myself. And when you have that kind of society, when so many people are from away and so many people from diverse backgrounds, you actually every day learn how to welcome and support each other in the way that our welcome was saying. And I think Torontonians will use that strength and skill over the next weeks and months to heal. But it was an awful tragedy. It's the first time I've spoken in public since it, and I just needed to acknowledge that. So that's not the best and most optimistic way to kick off remarks. Normally I come to places that are not Toronto and say, I'm from Toronto, I'm here to help you. I can tell you in Alberta that does not get the best reaction. BC is sort of neutral. So what I'm going to speak about today, and is it okay if I wander? Yes, I can wander, right? Because I have a voice too that can project without a microphone. I want to demonstrate that. I'm going to try to talk about some lessons I learned from my time as mayor in Toronto about how to really address issues of inclusion. The biggest lesson I learned is that the economy, the environment, and social justice go hand in hand. And you'll see I'll come back to that theme again today in the hour that I have. And by the way, I'm only a recovering politician. I haven't completely recovered, so use the idea of an hour loosely. I'm hoping to speak for about 45 minutes and give you some time for questions and discussion. I will come back to that theme again and again. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from the experience of Toronto, in what I'm going to discuss today, is that if you combine those three themes, prosperity, social justice, and attention to environmental values, you can really make significant progress. And that was my experience. What I'm actually going to talk about is a whole range of programs we did, but they're often linked in this theme. So am I going to have to ask you to, oh, this clicker. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to start with the most basic of municipal responsibilities, at least in Ontario, which is land use planning. Now, who are planners here? Okay, so great. Who are not planners? Oh, it's everybody else. Well, so this is Toronto's official plan from 2002, which wasn't updated until relatively recently. And it's a really important document, and it was under Mayor Mel Lastman, who was politically conservative. But the document is a very progressive and innovative document, and there's a variety of principles that are in it that are really relevant, I think, to issues of equality and justice. First of all, the blue areas are industrial lands, so they're supposed to be preserved for jobs. Very important. I'll give you some sense. This is Toronto. It's not the full region, but it's about 3 million people. So it would be like Vancouver, Surrey, Coquitlam, Maple Ridge, and Burnaby, maybe? give or take. So it's a pretty big area. Toronto's 43 kilometers across, and I'll come back to that much later with a story I'm going to tell. But it's a very big area, and when I was first elected in the 1990s, this was actually a region, and the provincial government amalgamated it in 1997. So I think there are regional lessons you can take from Toronto's post-amalgamation experience. So jobs is one of them, very important. Toronto was a significant manufacturing center. It still is one of only 7 cities in the world that actually does final assembly for aircrafts. And people don't think of Toronto that way, but it's actually relevant to social justice and inequality, because manufacturing jobs traditionally drove middle-class lifestyles, particularly heavily unionized manufacturing jobs. Very, very important. Toronto still has aircrafts, it still has auto parts. In the late 80s, the last GM plant closed in Toronto, mostly around Toronto now, and it still has food manufacturing, interestingly. So jobs are important, very significant. And that's the blue. The green is a credit to some very foresighted politicians post-war, because a lot of the green you see in this is the Rouge Valley, the Humber Valley, and the Don River Valley and the tributaries. And before Hurricane Hazel hit Toronto in 1954, anybody heard of Hurricane Hazel? Okay, good, good. Well done, Professor. Of course the professor knows, because it's an academic institution, I forgot.
I grew up on the Humber.
Oh, okay. Well, Professor Ferguson grew up on the Humber. So in 1954, Hurricane Hazel hit. And before that, people were building, and the city was allowing people to build in the green space, in the ravines and the river valleys. And in Hurricane Hazel, dozens of people died. I think the death count was 76 or 78. Don't quote me on that number, but it's that magnitude. The bridge over the Humber River at Bloor Street, which if you go there today and stand in a park, there's this massive, massive bridge above you, way above you, was washed out. And standing in that park, there's a blue wave about 30 feet up the bridge where the high water mark was. And this hurricane was extraordinary. And it wiped out the houses that were being built in the Humber River Valley in particular, and killed a lot of people in that valley. The provincial government after that passed laws for the whole province that said you can't build in ravines or within the high water mark anymore. So from 1954 on, this green space has been preserved because of environmental concerns and health and safety concerns, but to me it's become a defining feature of Toronto. People in Toronto value the environment, and they can experience it through Toronto Island, through a great park system, and through the ravines, which were preserved after that hurricane. I do need to tell, I live in Hyde Park, which is there. In fact, right there. There's a great story about Hyde Park, which is a very important green space in Toronto as well. It was donated by John Howard and his wife. They were very forward-thinking people in the late 1800s, and he had 2 conditions. One is you can't drink alcohol in Hyde Park, and to this day you cannot drink alcohol in Hyde Park. And the second is, I'll take a modest pension for the rest of my life. It turned out, and live in Hyde Park in a house called Cobham Lodge. Mr. Howard lived so long that his pension payments were worth far more than the land that he donated to the city. So there's a lesson about public-private partnerships. Anyway, it's forward thinking. So, whoops, did I say that? So Toronto's defined by industrial areas, green space, and then if you look at this map some more, you'll see some other things. And the intent of the plan, and 2 or 3 really important principles. One is, like Vancouver, Toronto is really challenged by urban sprawl. It's an environmental issue, it's a transportation issue, and it's an economic issue. For example, the municipalities around Toronto were incented by the province to subsidize employers to move from Toronto to the sprawl-based areas to provide jobs there. Which, if you think about it, is kind of a crazy planning idea, but that's what was happening in the 90s. So the idea of this plan was to say, sprawl is causing us these really significant issues around prosperity, around transportation, and around environmental challenges because the suburbs were car-based. And those challenges were in the suburbs too, not just in Toronto. So the idea of the plan is to bring growth back into the city. And it was to be done by allowing density to grow where there is or can be higher order rapid transit, either by light rail or by subway, depending on the nature of the neighborhood. And you can see that in the brown lines across. They're called avenues. That's actually in the bottom of the slide. You probably can't read that. It says avenues. The brown lines are where growth is to be directed and redevelopment to be directed. There's huge development pressure in the Toronto region. The question is, does it become sprawl-based and pave over farmland? Literally, that's literally what's happening, because we don't have an agricultural reserve. Or does it come into the city in a more sustainable way? And the idea behind this plan was bring it into the city. It's good for the region, it's good for the city, it's good for the city economy, it will create jobs, and it will be far more sustainable. There was also a second really important principle, and I was impressed that Mayor Lassman allowed this to go through, because it doesn't meet, I don't think, his personal thoughts about how a city should grow, because he's from a more suburban area. But one of the principles to this plan is that people should be able to live in the city of Toronto without having to own a car. And I think it's a fantastic principle of a land use plan. Jill and I don't own a car. We have. When you're the go-to carpool dad for 4 kids in hockey, you tend to have a car, but we don't anymore. Now, we're lucky, we live right beside a subway stop. There's some parts of Toronto, so I'll speak about in a few minutes, where you couldn't live that way, but that was the goal of the plan. Part of that was to be accomplished by trying to bring growth to these avenues. Now, you'll see the avenues are a bit broken up, like here, and here, and here, and here. That's as a result of political compromise, because certain city councillors didn't believe that their residents wanted to accommodate growth. So at the time, the mayor's office compromised with those councillors and took the avenue designation out of the plan. I like to believe that had I been the mayor, I wouldn't have done that. But the city of Toronto, there's 1 mayor and 44 councillors. You have to get at least 23 votes to get things through. Sometimes there are practical realities. But I think it's unfortunate. I think, and I believe we could have maintained the position that on a big, busy road where there was higher order rapid transit, you could welcome growth. Now, in order to facilitate that, it was very important to have a transit plan. This is Toronto's transit plan. Those of you who follow politics in Toronto will know that it's an ongoing debate. But at the heart of even today's plan is this plan that was introduced by my administration in 2007. I actually ran on the 2006 election, and it was a really interesting election, and the mayor will appreciate this. I ran on a platform that said, if we want a really great city, we're going to have to pay for it. We're going to have to raise taxes, people are going to have to give a little bit more, and we just got some new powers from the province to create whole new taxes. We're going to use those too, but we'll invest in the kind of city you want, and one of the things we'll do is build a network of light rail transit to suburban areas. Light rail because the suburban areas aren't built in a built form that has enough density to accommodate subways. And a network because in order to be a city where people can live without having to own a car, you need a transit network. If you just have a couple of lines, which is what Toronto really has now, the Yonge line and the Bloor line, people aren't going to be able to choose to not have a car. And that was the platform. There were other things that were important to the city that I spoke about as well, and we'll get into some of those. My opponent ran on a platform saying, I'm going to freeze taxes and build subways. And it was really interesting because every political advisor at a provincial level would say, oh my God, what are you doing? You cannot tell people that you're going to raise taxes, let alone create entirely new ones. Are you crazy? I got 60% of the vote. Well, 59, but let's call it 60. Okay? It's not an academic. And my opponent got about 30. It was about 2 to 1. And people were prepared to say, if there was somebody they trusted, and there was a vision that they could buy into, they were prepared to say, yes, I'm prepared to pay a little bit more. It was a really interesting moment. Of course, there have been other campaigns since then in which people got elected saying, I'm going to freeze taxes and build subways. They did neither, but they did get elected on that platform. So this is important. Transit City Light Rail Plan 2007 was announced in about March through Adam Giambroni, who was chair of the Toronto Transit Commission. Premier McGuinty announced full funding for it on January 15th, 2007. A couple of things about that. Like in British Columbia, it's very difficult in Ontario for cities to build the kind of infrastructure that's needed to support the policy directions that council agrees on, because you don't have access to enough diffuse different sources of tax revenue, particularly either share the income or the sales tax. So that's why you always have to go ask for permission from the province, and it becomes problematic because it means things don't happen unless you have a provincial government and local governments that can all agree at the same time, and as you've seen in BC through the failed referendum, it becomes really difficult. So June 15th, that's the first thing about June 15th. The second is that I remember it was that day because it was my wedding anniversary. And Jill and I had agreed when I was elected mayor that we would always spend, I would take that one day off, and we would always spend it together. Usually we went to Stratford and saw a play. And we got a call on about June 11th from the Premier's office saying, would the mayor be available? We want to announce $20 billion in funding for Transit City. The answer to that question is yes, by the way. You are available. So we said, of course, when is it? June 15th. So I had to phone Jill and say, Jill, I know we're going to Stratford, I've got to cancel, but would you mind spending our wedding anniversary together in a bus garage in Mississauga? For those of you in relationships of some permanence, I do not advise having that conversation. The next year we went to Madrid. Yeah, but the balance still, I think I still owe on that. Anyway, so transit plan is coming. And I'm going to speak to the transit plan because later again, a couple of times, because it's about accommodating the official plan goals. It's also obviously about environmental goals, but at its heart, I think good transit plans, and this plan in particular, is about social inclusion and social justice. And I'll make that point a couple of times later. So the vision of the planners was you'd have this kind of mid-rise construction along the light rail lines. This is taken from a presentation by the planning department on Shepherd Avenue, where the LRT is there. Oh, by the way, the Eglinton Crosstown is being built. The Shepherd Avenue started and was canceled at the cost of $100 million, and is supposed to be restarted. Finch was about to start, was canceled, restarting. I'm sure this happens in BC too, but it's coming along in the way it's supposed to. So the idea was a lot of these streets today have very small post-war bungalows. And the idea was to bring density. There's some challenges about gentrification, and happy to discuss that in the questions afterwards. But the idea is a small post-war bungalow on a major transit route is not a sensible use of space, and that is furthering the problem of sprawl. So that's a little bit of background on the official plan. Second thing we were doing at the same time, and this started through a study with the provincial government, the federal government, the United Way, and the private sector, and was also prompted by some of David Helchansky's work. Do people here know Professor Helchansky and his work on three cities? Okay. So we did some work to look and see where the challenges of poverty in Toronto were the most significant. There's 144 defined neighborhoods in Toronto. They're on this map. And that study showed that we could prioritize about 14 of them, maybe 16. It changed over time a little bit on which neighborhoods, based on where was the highest correlation between low incomes and a lack of public investment. So we didn't just study where low incomes were, we studied where are the places that have historically suffered from a lack of public investment in public goods, like libraries, community centers, schools, programs to help young people get jobs, other community interventions. And these were the priority neighborhoods that came out of that study. And what we did at City Hall was, and the reason they're called priority is because they became a priority for public investment, and we actually prioritized public investment for these neighborhoods. So as we were thinking about where to build community centers, they came to priority neighborhoods first. As we were thinking about job training programs and programs to reach youth who needed opportunity, they came to priority neighborhoods first. And it was a really important strategy. It was actually part of the city's community safety plan. And the community safety plan was a really interesting plan because it said right in the plan, and this passed council unanimously, it said right in the plan that safety is not just the absence of crime. It's about inclusion and having a meaningful voice in society. So it was about social justice. And that's why we were able to work on the priority neighborhoods, particularly with a focus in youth. And the other interesting thing about this, and David Helchansky's studies are similar, is the places that there haven't been public investment in Toronto that are low income tend to be in the inner suburbs, like Etobicoke, Scarborough, North York, not in the former downtown. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is that many of those areas became immigrant settlement areas. People are working class, hardworking, low income, and don't have a vote. And it's very interesting to see the correlation over time of the fact that landed immigrants in Canada, unlike many other countries, people who've made a permanent commitment to this country, but don't have a vote, what happens to public investment? They pay taxes, property taxes, like everybody else. And the new land transfer tax that was brought in 2007, that, by the way, has financed the city of Toronto since, otherwise it would have been bankrupt, but that's an aside. And if you go to these neighborhoods or look at the statistics, you will see very high proportions of landed immigrants who are excluded systematically from the political process. And it's a really interesting conclusion. The conclusion I drew from that was that landed immigrants, people who've made a permanent commitment to Canada, should have a vote to help offset this, because it's bad for the whole city. It's bad for everybody that you have continuing pockets of poverty. And I came out publicly in favor of that. We didn't get anywhere, unfortunately. We started a campaign about it, but I still think it's a really important part of the solution, because if you don't have a democratic voice in a democratic system, you're not going to get the investments that are needed. And I'll come back to these neighborhoods in a little while. And I wanted to give you an example, which doesn't happen to be from a priority neighborhood, but it's an important example because it's a project that you probably know that worked, and the principles underlying it are the same kinds of principles as we used in the priority neighborhoods. Because one of the really important principles in the priority neighborhood strategy was that we want to engage people in their community. And engaging them means city officials and politicians going to where they are and listening to them about their needs. Not coming in with a preconceived idea of what their needs are, but listening to them. And then doing your level best to make the change that they ask. So for example, in the Jane Finch community, a community that was marked by high levels of violence, a stereotype might have been bring some basketball courts so the kids have after-school activities. We went to the community and spoke to people and listened. And what they wanted was not basketball courts, they wanted a theater. So we built them a theater in a community center. It was something like this, perhaps not quite as nice, but they had a theater. And why did they want a theater? They wanted their own voice. They felt very disempowered as young people, and they wanted an ability to do things that gave them a say. Another community, Flemington Park, similar thing, they wanted a radio station. And I learned, I didn't know this, that In Canada, it's, if you broadcast for less than, I think it's a kilometer, under the CRTC, you don't need a license. So we got somebody to donate a $50,000 set of equipment that was a studio for a radio station, and we opened a radio station in Flemington Park, or helped open it, which the young people completely ran. They called it Flemo Radio, and it was their thing, and it was their voice, and for them, it was immensely powerful. But they didn't ask for basketball courts. In fact, in Flemington Park, the most popular sport's cricket, but that's a separate point. The only intervention we made was that we offered an interview with the current mayor of Toronto as their first interview in a way they couldn't say no. But after that, they got to choose who they wanted to interview and what they wanted to put on their radio station. And it was fascinating to me that the process of engaging people and giving them a real say dramatically changed the kinds of conclusions and the kinds of opportunities that were created. And another example is the revitalization of Regent Park, which people probably know about. That's what this is a photograph of. And it was a fascinating process led by Derek Ballantyne, who used to run Toronto Community Housing Company, who was an absolute visionary and a highly effective leader. And we knew two things. As you probably know, Regent Park was Canada's oldest social housing. It was built post-war, and the idea was it was built for returning soldiers, and they built it inward-looking so that there were little kinds of little squares inside Regent Park. And they also did something that turned out to be really foolish, but was well-intentioned at the time. They built it in a way that cut off all the streets around it, because the neighborhoods around it at that time weren't the nicest neighborhoods. So they said, let's build this place that's beautiful for these returning veterans. They would have to deal with all these, poor housing. They could live in this new housing, but we're going to close off the roads and everything. And of course, over time, that produced a disastrous result. As the neighborhoods changed and the low-income neighborhoods around Regent Park gentrified, the fact that it was cut off meant low-income people and much higher-income people didn't really mix anymore. And by the 1990s, it had become a very cut-off place, marked by violence in those little parks. So we knew that we wanted to reopen the streets and reintegrate the neighborhood into the neighborhood around it. We knew something else, we had to. The buildings were at the end of their useful life. And Derek said, stop. Stop there. Let's not do anything else whatsoever. Let's do no other planning. Let's go to the people of Regent Park and tell them now that we have to rebuild their homes. We want to rebuild it in a way that reconnects it with the streets around, but we don't know anything else, and what do they want? And it was really fascinating, because the first thing people said was, we like our neighborhood, we want to be able to stay here, and if we get a job with a higher income, we'd like to be able to stay here. Can you build some mixed income housing so that if I'm doing better, I can stay in the neighborhood where my kids are growing up, which was not expected. Really interesting. Second thing they said was, how much are you going to spend? Might be $2 billion. If you're spending $2 billion in our neighborhood, what jobs are our kids going to get from that $2 billion in our neighborhood? And that resulted in a program where all of the contractors who were doing the work on rebuilding had to hire 25% of their staff locally. And these kinds of interventions seem to be out of fashion. There's this idea that if you just let the economy go, it's all going to work. Well, it doesn't. We've seen since 1980 very significant increase in inequality. It's getting worse now. We need to think about how to orient our economy in ways that support everybody. And in some ways, this was a small thing, but it was a very big deal for the people there. And I went out, I had the privilege, because I was the mayor, of demolishing the first wall in the first building that had to be demolished. It was like a 12-year-old boy's dream, right? I had this machine, I forgot what it's called, it has a wrecking ball on it, big ball, and I got to pull the ball back and let it go and knock down the wall. It was just fantastic. And I'm in a hard hat, It's on the front page of the newspaper the next day. It was just great until the Ministry of Labor said, does David Miller have a license to run that machine? Oh. And they shut down the job. I'm not kidding. Anyway, a bit embarrassing, right? But I spoke to the contractor and I said, what do you think about this 25% higher? And he said, you know, Mayor, I really thought when I was told this that you guys were crazy. What are you doing making me hire unqualified people just because they live here? We've got a job to do, we want to get it done. He said, but I was wrong. All of my permanent employees tell me it's the best thing they've ever done, that these young people are thirsty to learn the skills and they're thirsty for the opportunity, and it's so rewarding for my team to mentor them, which was fantastic feedback. There are a couple other things people said they wanted, which I think urban geographers will know. Grocery store. There's no grocery store there. A bank. And then one other thing that people in a low-income community wanted. I'm going to ask you to guess. One other thing. I'll give you a clue. Symbolic of... Yes. Yep. They wanted a Tim Hortons. Right? So it's fascinating. They say, what do you want? Well, we want middle-income housing, so if we get a better job, we can move into it. We want jobs for our children. We want a grocery store, a bank, and Tim's. It was symbolic, I think, of that they were making it. They also asked for really high environmental standards in the buildings, by the way, coming both from air quality kind of issues, but also from energy consumption. So this is on a unique kind of district heating, and the buildings are all built to very high environmental standards. And all of that came about because people were engaged from the beginning in listening because of the social justice perspective brought to the issue. So that's just symbolic of the jobs. Those people actually did not work on Regent Park. Just a photograph I have. It's a carpenter's training program that also helps low-income people learn skills and get their certification to become carpenters. Next issue, and I apologize for doing these sort of sequentially, but I don't want to give the impression that we had this big plan that we said, okay, in 2004 we'll do safety and priority neighborhoods. 2005 didn't quite work like that. Things evolved, but one of the issues we worked very strongly on was childcare, and this was particularly important in the low-income neighborhoods for obvious reasons. For people to survive, everybody has to be working. So what happens to the children? Well, when Paul Martin was elected Prime Minister, the Liberal Party ran on a platform that they would finance the construction of childcare centres all over Canada. And our, Toronto, by the way, people might not know this, outside of Quebec, Toronto is the largest direct provider of childcare in Canada, and also a significant funder of non-municipally owned childcare. It's provincial subsidy, but it comes through the city. So we operate and oversee childcare centers, really important as part of a social equity continuum. And when the Liberal Party promised this, we made a plan. We said, what's Toronto's share going to be? We made a plan. And the plan was to open 63 new childcare centers. And if they'd done phase 2, they were going to be about another 60. And that would have meant the wait list in Toronto for childcare would have gone down to 3 months, which essentially is not a wait list or close enough. It's very good. And so they got elected, they put the money in, we put our application in, we opened 63 new childcare centers, almost all of them in the priority neighborhoods, because we'd already passed the priority neighborhoods strategy, and it said we've got to make our investments in those neighborhoods. And of course it's where people desperately need childcare in order to work. And a couple of anecdotes about that. One of the openings, which was in a Catholic school, which was the first time ever, they'd only been in public schools before, first time ever. The custodian came over to me and started crying. It was so incredibly touching. And I said to him, why are you crying? He said, because I'm so happy for my son. And I said, why? And he said, because he has somewhere safe to go after school, because I work till 6. My wife died last year, and I'm on my own. And these tears are pouring down his face. And at another opening, there was no media at that opening. At another opening in the Jane Finch community, the Toronto Star came in City TV. A couple of weeks later, there was a murder, and Global alone had 3 cameras there. You know, it was a field of cameras. Same community, media all over it. And the juxtaposition of those things made me kind of sad as somebody who believes in democracy. Because that man crying is a beautiful story that somebody should be telling in the media. But because our reaction is to go where there's a tragedy and not where there's something beautiful, there was nobody there to tell it. You know, I've told it once or twice now, maybe more. But I think it's really unfortunate. And, you know, the Paul Martin government lost and was replaced by the Stephen Harper government, which didn't have childcare funding. We weren't able to build the next 60 childcare. The waiting list in Toronto now is, I think, over a year for people who are seeking childcare. Stories like that man's being in the media could actually make a difference to people's understanding of what the kind of commitments governments may do in real, for and with real people in real neighborhoods. So I've always felt very sad that it's hard to get attention for these kinds of good news announcements. So I've spoken a bit about planning, a bit about transportation, a lot about the social equity platform. I'd like to talk a bit about the environment now, and then when I wrap up before questions, I'm going to try to pull together how these all fit together. Toronto has a really great climate plan. First one was from 2007, it's just updated last year. Based on this plan and the closing of a coal-fired plant by the provincial government, the greenhouse gas emissions for the Toronto geographic area, not the city's operations, the place where 3 million people live, that geographic area that has manufacturing, all of that, are now today about 24% below 1990 levels, which is a dramatic, dramatic drop. And it demonstrates a bunch of things. First of all, people, no, I know they wouldn't say this in British Columbia, but people who say that you can't afford to take the steps necessary to combat climate change, it's just ludicrous. If anything, Toronto's economy is too hot. We were facing the same kinds of dislocations as you are in BC because of the price of housing. Really, really challenging. And that's during an era of significant greenhouse gas emissions. This was completely unanimous by council. And that, to me, municipal governments are very democratic. City councilors really listen to their constituents. And, you know, my successor was on council, I think it's fair to say, had a different approach to things than I did. And he voted for this. And that told me that Torontonians, said a few minutes ago, they're green. They really, really wanted action on climate. Of course, this came to council just after Inconvenient Truth came out. So I wish I could say that was deliberate. I waited till Al Gore galvanized the world and then brought a strategy, but it was not quite that organized. But it really helped. And every single member of council was in their seats voting on that, because the vote immediately afterwards was on the introduction of the new taxes that I promised in the election. And as you can guess, that was not unanimous, but they got through. So, and why is this plan relevant to the social justice kind of issues we're talking about? For a variety of reasons. First of all, at its heart, it's also about jobs. And let me go back a step. One of the reasons that there's a significant importance for the leadership of cities in climate is that most of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world are either because of cities or because of the activities it takes to sustain them, like coal-fired power plants in the United States. So if you add the emissions that occur in cities together with things like the power plants that sustain them, worldwide, according to the C40, about 70 to 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world can be attributed to cities. And those are predominantly in 4 areas: transportation, how we heat and cool our buildings, how we generate our electricity, and how we manage our waste. So Toronto's plan addressed all of those things in all sorts of different ways. But one thing I wanted to highlight, part of our plan was called Live Green Toronto. It's up there on the left. That was a program where we created a grants program, little tiny micro grants, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, maybe up to $10,000, to go to communities who wanted to do something that was going to make the community better and reduce greenhouse gases. A simple project might be turning some unused land into a community garden. More complex one might be community level solar and at the time there wasn't a subsidy for it through the provincial government. So it was important that there be something from the city. And we also hired people to work in the priority neighborhoods to help low-income neighborhoods figure out how to access these funds. So those people would be right in the community helping them organize. Lots of other things. Don't need to go through all of it because this talk isn't really about the environmental issues, but energy retrofits on buildings create lots of jobs. And I'll get to that in a minute. If you're doing a low-income neighborhood, how do you approach it to see who gets the jobs? Green energy, Toronto has deep lake water cooling, which is pretty cool. They take the water from Lake Ontario, which is a constant temperature at the bottom all year round. And all of downtown, air conditioning used to be essentially powered by coal. Deep lake water cooling took it off. Very cool. Some other stuff we can get into later if people have questions. But just to give you a sense, there's a whole range of things happening. And in Toronto's case, in New York's case, certainly in Vancouver's case, because you have green energy grid, Vancouver City proper, not Greater Vancouver. In a lot of world cities, the biggest single emitter is buildings. In Toronto, it's 60%. In New York, it's about 80%. And it's how we heat and cool them. So we spent a lot of time in that strategy thinking about how to ensure new buildings were built to the highest standards. So there's a green building standard in Toronto. And how to do energy retrofits on old buildings, which is hard for a city because old buildings are already there and we don't necessarily have the full jurisdiction over them. So one of the pilot programs, which is now sort of percolating all over Ontario, and I hope percolates across Canada, was called Tower Renewal. And the idea behind Tower Renewal came from some engineers at the University of Toronto who were really smart. And they looked at buildings like this. These are called concrete slab apartment buildings that were built in the 1960s and 1970s out of concrete, subsidized by the federal government as a part of the post-war need for housing. They're all over Canada. There's 1,000 in Toronto, 2,000 in the Toronto region, in every city in Canada. I grew up in Ottawa after we emigrated from England. We actually lived in a building very much like these. And because they're concrete, they have two really important properties. One is they're here forever. So these buildings will be here forever, essentially. 100 years, the engineers say, probably considerably longer. The second is concrete has no insulating power whatsoever. So they're horribly wasteful of energy, and it's counterintuitive. A one-bedroom apartment in a building like this uses more energy to heat and cool than a small house. And the result of that, the engineers said, was if you put insulation on the outside, which is relatively cost-effective, you could dramatically lower the energy consumption. And if you did it on all 1,000 buildings in Toronto, you would reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to the geographic area of Toronto by 5%. The Kyoto Accord, which countries agreed to a long time ago about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the first target was to reduce them by 6%. So this would have met Toronto's Kyoto obligation just by properly insulating these buildings, which when they were built wasn't thought about because energy was cheap. So some architects looked at that and said, hey, this is a great idea. If you did that with really funky panels and design and color, you could really rejuvenate neighborhoods. They'd look great. We've actually done this in Paris and Bratislava, I think, and some other European cities. And they brought it to the city. And because we look at things environmentally, prosperity, and social justice, we looked at it and said, hey, wait a minute, a lot of these buildings are in low-income neighborhoods in Toronto, many of them in priority neighborhoods. How do we find a way to ensure that both the process and the results are inclusive? So the pilot project took the idea and went to the residents of buildings with diverse landlords, some public, some individuals, some big corporations, and went to the residents and said, we have this possibility, what do you want? What would you like to see in your neighborhood? And it was really interesting because they had somewhat different answers than Regent Park. Although the same one, jobs. If you're going to do this and spend all this money, we want jobs for our children in our neighborhoods. The second thing they said was, we don't want our rents to go up and get pushed out because these apartments are affordable. And the third thing they said was, we want some opportunity as entrepreneurs. Nowhere commercially zoned. So you can go to 1503 and get a haircut, you know, your nails done. You can go to 1715 and get an entire new set of dentures. There's all sorts of this underground economy, and people actually wanted the chance. They said, you know, if there was a shop downstairs, I'd rent it and do it there. But there isn't. And it was fascinating. They also wanted us to help with the green space. They wanted the green space to feel safe to them. So they talked about gardens and farms and place for children. Really interesting and significant. And the kinds of jobs these would be created in Toronto would be unionized. So the city brought the unions to the table and said, is there a way you could help train the young people who live in a building you're doing work on for a contractor to get the skills necessary to have these jobs? And I think this program brings those three themes together in a really great and clear way. The city has just passed, it's taken years, but they've now passed some financing methods for this that are sort of like the PACE system in the US. So hopefully it's going to start happening at scale over the next couple of years. So 2 more points and then I'll wrap up. This is happening globally, not just in Toronto, the connection between climate, prosperity, and social justice. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm with the C40 Cities now, which is a group of the world's largest cities working together on climate change, founded by Mayor Ken Livingstone of London in 2005. And one of my responsibilities is what we call inclusive climate action, which is equity. Climate change impacts the poorest of the global poor, and even in the developed world, differentially impacts low-income communities. How do we provide solutions to climate that are solutions for the economic and social challenges of those communities? That's who the C40 is. And there's some great examples. New York City saw this firsthand. Because Hurricane Sandy, yes, it hit Wall Street, but it also hit many of the poorest neighborhoods in New York, places like Queens, places that still have wood sewers that are over 150 years old and that are still actually rebuilding from Hurricane Sandy. And so New York City's climate plans are all about social equity and inclusion, as well as Mayor Bill de Blasio. His whole political career has been about inclusion and social equity. Los Angeles doing a similar thing with a program called Watts Rising. Very interesting. There's public housing, a fairly low-income working-class neighborhood around the public housing, and then manufacturing there that is poisoning the air and the water and the land. And the people there are really organized about environmental issues. Their first issue are public health-related ones, but it allows them a path to climate, and Los Angeles is doing some really interesting work through that program. So the final point I wanted to make is about how I see these issues coming together, and it's through public transit. And we talked a bit about the economic side of this, the planning side, about bringing in development and jobs. That's also a bulwark against sprawl, but it's an economic side. We talked about the transportation need for it. You know, if you've been to Toronto, because there's no transit network within Toronto, no real network of rapid transit, and because the regions outside Toronto are entirely car dependent, there is terrible transportation chaos. But at its heart, transportation, for me, is a social justice issue. If you look again at this map and then see these, that's a map of where there are clusters of those towers that I was just talking about. And many of those towers in most parts of Toronto are also places where low-income residents live because it's the cheapest rent that they can get. And this will show you where the priority neighborhoods are. So if you look at these three charts, you've got the transit map, the tower map overlaid with transit only in red, and the priority neighborhoods map. And what do you see? These new lines, the light rail lines, aren't just about creating a network, they're also about connecting these low-income neighborhoods into the fabric of city life. And why is that? Well, the network was planned on two principles. The first was to meet the needs of the official plan to direct growth. But the second was based on basic transit principles of who's taking transit, where are they, where are the biggest number of riders who really need a rapid transit to get off the bus. And of course, who's riding the bus? Low-income communities, predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly. And I certainly, when Mum and I came to Canada, the first winter in Ottawa, there was 14 feet of snow. For you younger people, feet is an old measurement system we used to have before metric. And she took a look at it and said, I'm not driving this country. So we took the bus everywhere. That's how I grew up. But in Toronto, if you have to take the bus to work, it's tough. And so what the transit plan does is not just provide transportation for the city, not just support the official plan goals of growth, but it knits the city together, low income and high income alike. And if you look at Toronto today and David Hulchansky's maps of where the three cities are, high income people are clustered around the subway, and low income people are clustered around bus routes. And this plan has a chance to change that. In fact, there was something from David Hulchansky yesterday that said in 1980, there was something like 15 low-income neighborhoods in Toronto, or some small number. Today there's 88 out of 144. Increasing inequality is the issue of our time. And why does that matter so much to people? When we were doing our public engagements about Transit City, I took a bus starting at 6 in the morning in Malvern, which is up here. I took the Malvern bus down to Shepherd, and the Shepherd bus across, and eventually I went to York University, which is there. And there was a woman on the Malvern bus, and she stayed on Shepherd, and she said, Mayor, what are you doing on my bus? I said, we're coming to talk to you about light rail transit. And she said, what's that? And I said, it's like European-style trams. They run in the middle of the road. They've got their own right-of-way so they don't get caught in rush hour traffic. So they're more reliable, they come on time, and they're faster. And she said, that would be great. That's great. I would really like that. And I said, great. Well, where are you going? And she said, to work. Where do you work? I work at Pearson Airport. Okay, well, okay. That sort of takes away the dramatic part, doesn't it? So Pearson Airport's up here. I said, how do you get to Pearson? She said, well, I'll go to the Shepherd subway, then the Yonge subway, then I'll take the Finch bus, and then the Malton bus. How long does that take you? 2 hours, if I make my connection, but in the winter, sometimes I miss it. You've got a long day. He said, oh, that's my morning job. In the afternoon, I'm a cleaner at the Royal York Hotel, down here. So bus, subway, and then subway, bus. So something like 8 buses, 6 subway rides. And like most people who live in low-income neighborhoods, she's working two jobs, some people 3. So she probably spends 4 hours a day on transit. What does that mean for her? It means, first of all, she's not there with her family for dinner. Secondly, unlike my mom, who went back to school and graduated at the age of 56 by taking night courses, she can't go upgrade her skills because she does simply not have the time to get to any places she could learn more skills to get 1 job instead of having to live on 2. And as it happens, there's a community college right here, Centennial College, but she can't possibly do it. The other thing it means is she can't go to the public meetings and demand that the politicians build the light rail line that comes to her house. So she's systematically excluded from democratic decision making. That's why public transit is so important. And that's why thinking about social justice, environmental issues, and economic or prosperity issues at the same time matters so much. Because this plan is an example of what all the best plans do. They write economic issues, they provide environmental solutions, but they also provide social inclusion at their heart. And I think that's what all of a city government's best plans should do, and really, that's how we're going to address inequality, whether it's through a transit plan or other plans, addressing all 3 of those at the same time. I've gone beyond what I said I would. I apologize, Karen, but we've still got time for questions. Thank you so much for your time. And I should say, this has been sitting in front of me the entire time. Watch out, panelists. Any questions or comments? Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you.
Yeah, I think like the social justice lens on transit is wonderful, and I guess what I'm wondering is what plans were taken into consideration to once the light rail or subways were introduced to keep these neighborhoods affordable? Because I know in the Lower Mainland context, once any rapid transit planning is introduced, like land values skyrocket and will get pushed out.
It's a really difficult issue, and I think, well, you can see it here, literally here. Municipalities don't have the full set of tools to do that, but of everything I've said, that's the one thing that wasn't solved properly. Now, the idea behind the light rail lines is to have medium density along the line rather than nodal development like here, and to some extent that helps. You know, in Ontario we now have rent control, so that helps. City of Toronto has a policy that we've lost legal battles over a couple of times, but it's still the policy that you can't displace tenants in an application for new building. So there are some tools. Inclusive zoning might be another one, but I think it's the one thing that people haven't properly solved. And the risk of this is that all of Toronto will become like the areas on the Yonge and Bloor line. And you will see what's happened in places like Paris, and I think to some extent the GVRD, where the working class has been pushed out of the core completely. I think it's less likely to happen because of some of those policy levers, but I have to say that they're not good enough to be certain, and I think we need to do some work on policy levers to solve that problem better. For example, in Vancouver, my understanding is in the city of Vancouver proper, if it rezones a condominium, it can say you've got to have a co-op in it. Toronto, you can't do that. We could do something like, when you approve a transit line, ensure that some of the land had to be for social housing, and the city does have policies about affordable housing, but they get interpreted to mean affordable prices to buy rather than affordable rental. And that doesn't meet the needs of people who need affordable housing nearly often enough. Yes?
Thanks, Mr. Miller, for this elaboration upon your approach to improving the City of Toronto. And then I'm just wondering if you could maybe reflect on how you take some of these hard infrastructure and hard policies, social development kinds of prescriptions that I can tell you're very passionate about how these work for the City of Toronto in terms of preserving its inclusivity as you move forward towards a more sustainable future. But I'm just wondering if you could maybe push that towards what you're doing with C40 and thinking about, like, what are some of the best stories or approaches that you've heard from your colleagues in that network about how to engage in more of the, not the hard policy, but the soft values conversation about why an inclusive city matters? Because it seems to me as we get this increasing gap, it's harder to make the case, like, so what if the whole city becomes like Yonge and Bloor? Well, what's wrong with that?
It's a really interesting question. I guess for me, I should tell you a bit about my background. I grew up in a small village in England with my mom and my grandfather. I'm the only child of a single mom. This village was pretty basic. Nobody had any money. Nobody threw anything out, not because we were environmentalists, but because you couldn't afford it, so you fixed things. And everybody lived what we would call now kind of a sustainable lifestyle. Like, we all had our own little gardens, we had compost heaps, just because that's how you lived. And one of the things that was marked by was real class distinction, even though it was a tiny village. There were landed gentry that owned the village. And because my mom was the teacher, not a teacher, we were invited once a year to the landed gentry for dinner. Not twice, not breakfast, once a year. And it was actually Sunday dinner, so it was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, that was our place in the social hierarchy. My friends were farmers' children, and the children who lived in council housing, which is the English equivalent of council housing. We had 3 council houses, okay, a small place. I spoke like that. It's a very distinctive local accent. And every night, my mom would say to me, you can't speak like that, you have to speak like the queen. Because if you speak like a farmer, that's all you'll ever be. Okay, I'm 4 years old, so I'm being told every day. England also had a test back then called the 11+. And at the age of 11, you took a test, and if you didn't pass, you went to technical school. Unless you were rich, in which case you went to a private school, and then you could go on to university. So it was really obvious for me as a little boy that there were distinctions based on class and background that were really difficult for people to overcome, and it's why I've spent my entire political career, I think, fighting about these issues, and the environment is only part of it. And so in that context, it's always been obvious to me that the people who have power and influence and money are going to do everything they can to fight to keep it. So, I mean, my real answer to your question is we need to speak up. I'm not sure it's about examples, showing examples that work. Scandinavia works. Canadian healthcare works. You know, when I speak in the US now, I always pull out my OHIP card. And I say, hey, by the way, I know Republicans say people don't like it. We love it. And I wave it around. But, you know, Scandinavia works. Our healthcare works. It doesn't, the reality of those facts doesn't matter. I think it's more an emotional thing. And it's harder to, you see in Scandinavia, one could argue that Scandinavia, one of the reasons why there is such equality there is that everybody's the same and look the same. And it means it's not us and you, it's just us. Toronto is so diverse that there's no us and you either, because who's the us and who's the you? And that's a really good thing. I think in places like the US, we don't see that as much. There's really us and you by, you know, by race or ethnic background. And it's harder in those contexts to appeal to the heart. It's about appealing to the heart. And I think it's, you know, our political leaders need to speak to this issue all the time, but we also need to as well. You know, it's not just up to the people we elect to help establish that relative equality is a good thing. And we need to talk about it in terms of solidarity and democracy, but also in people terms. You know, and I mean, you know, we're about to be faced in Ontario potentially with a government that isn't very progressive on these issues, to say the least. I never thought I would see, you know, somebody who espouses what the current leader of the Conservative Party does in Ontario be leading in the polls. I mean, Conservatives in Ontario used to raise taxes and build things, right? They built all the subways in Toronto. So my conclusion is it's an unending fight, and we have to make the case every day, but we have to do it through appealing to people's hearts, which means telling stories, giving examples, inspiring their passion, inspiring their generosity of spirit. Look how people have responded in Toronto to the tragedy of Young and Finch. They responded with huge generosity of spirit. I think we have to appeal to that. Sorry to give such a long answer, but it's not, it's a very fundamental, hard question. Yes?
Thank you for your presentation today and for joining us and sharing your wisdom and your words with us. I'm wondering if you can comment a bit about how, in a large city like Toronto, you work with adjacent municipalities. So in the Vancouver metro
Just
area.
give me 1 second. Just give me some instructions. How long do we take questions?
Just this will be the last question.
Okay. Great. Sorry. Why don't you start over? I apologize.
Okay, no worries. So I'm just wondering if you can comment about how in Toronto you worked with the adjacent municipalities. So in Vancouver, we have something like maybe 20 or 26 different municipalities. Mayors get paid anywhere from $14,000 honorariums to $200,000.
$200,000?
Well, I mean, somewhere in the range.
I didn't get paid $200,000.
So I think there's a large sort of disparity in both what the role is expected to be, but also people's expertise as they come forward, and the resources they have to do their jobs as council, as mayors, as staff.
So a few things there. First of all, I'm not going to give you my advice. I'm going to give Richard Daley's advice. Okay? And Richard Daley was a great mayor of Chicago. And the best mayors, in my experience, absolutely love their city. They wear that love on their sleeve, and they leave no stone unturned to make it better. That's what Richard Daley did. Hazel McCallion's much adored as the mayor of Mississauga. That's how she behaved. She loved Mississauga. I find that kind of weird, but she truly loved it. So Richard Daley, forgotten what he wanted to do, was something like annexing the highway that connected O'Hare Airport with Chicago. What he did was he pulled all the local mayors together and for a decade talked about their issues and how Chicago could help them and listen to them. And by the way, there is a commonality between mayors, whether they're 13,000 or salaries like unimaginable in Toronto, because you're ultimately you're the one. Everybody stops you in the street and says, X is happening. Please do something about it. Whether it's a pothole, a riot, a tragedy, building transit, you know, your soccer team winning the MLS championship and almost winning the CONCACAF Champions League, whatever it is, you're responsible for it, right? It's a commonality between mayors. He worked for a decade to build the bonds between the mayors on local issues and then raise this one of, here's what I need. And the lesson I take from that is about the building of the bonds. And so what do you need to do that? Well, you need mutual respect and listening. You need to think on some issues that span the region. So I worked with the regional chairs because the mayor of Toronto is more like a regional chair, and sometimes with the mayors, depending who it was, like Hazel we worked with. On environmental issues, people around Toronto really care about that actually. On transit funding from the federal and provincial governments and housing, and that was it. We just focused on those things, but we had similar kinds of issues. So it wasn't about the differences, it was about the commonality, which is what Richard did. The other thing is you need some kind of structure. He created a Chicago's Mayor's Council. What we had was Metrolinx, which is your TransLink. And unlike here, the Mayor of Toronto, 3 other appointees from Toronto, the regional chairs, were all on the board. So over lunch, we had an informal opportunity to talk about these regional issues. And one thing that I see in Vancouver that's horribly dysfunctional is you got a TransLink board and then a Mayor's Council. And the Mayor's Council is completely dysfunctional because it doesn't have any real ability to influence the decisions, but it also doesn't have to take any responsibility for them. So people on it can take positions that are untenable because they're never accountable for the decisions. And I thought the original structure of Metrolinx, which by the way the province got rid of, I think because it wanted to be able to make the decisions itself, was brilliant in terms of building an accidentally positive result, building that regional cooperation. And I don't know what this government's position is on that issue, and it may be that it's just one of these provincial things that can't change no matter who's in power. But if you had mayors actually running TransLink, you could create that kind of dynamic, and it would be would have the potential for some really amazing results. That has to be the last question because I ran over time. It's my fault, but thank you for your questions, great questions, and your ongoing work. Please keep it up. Thanks very much.